time paradox.
Speaking of Marvel's empire, this week's comic in review is the latest cog in the Marvel wheel. It is called The New Warriors, written by Fabian Nicieza, with art by Mark Bagley and Al Williamson. The cog in the wheel metaphor is appropriate, since Marvel always appears to be moving, but generally winds up where they started again, despite any ostensible changes. With Judy and I to discuss this controversial and influential writer are, on my left, Catherine Kramer, who is the editor of the recently released Walls of Fear anthology, among many others. On the other side, we've got Celeste Hoteling, co-organizer of the Orbit Science Fiction Conventions, and Bob DeCandido, book preservation specialist and Heinlein devotee.
I believe he was given that name in the late 40s. At that time, his novel Beyond This Horizon was considered the best science fiction novel ever written. It's no longer one of his major books. And at the same time, he was also a strong character in the science fiction field. He tended to wear a white suit and had a very strong physical presence. And so he got the nickname the Dean of Science Fiction at that time.
He addressed that point himself when people began calling him this. And his point was that in Starship Troopers, everybody read it as being a society where only soldiers could be citizens. And his point was that the idea behind the novel, and what the novel actually says, is that to be a citizen, you have to do a service. That to become a citizen, you have to earn the right, you're not born with it, and that the way you became a citizen was to put in a service. Could be military, but it could also be medical. It could be, there were a number of ways that he mentions within the book that you could do it.
William Morris, way back in the 1800s, wrote Socialist Utopia, which we briefly mentioned last week, called News from Nowhere, in which everyone could do what they want, and whatever was natural they did. And his women could do whatever they wanted, but they naturally wanted to do things like be barmaids and housewives. It's very natural for them to do that. That's what they wanted to do, and that's all they could do. So, he was considered very enlightened for his time period, they would say. That was argued back and forth. Now, Jim Frankel said on our Women in Science Fiction show that the Heinlein woman was the woman who could do anything, but God, where could she get that man? And then I think someone else on our panel that week said, well, he was very enlightened for his time. Now, William Morris in the 1800s was enlightened. What I want to know is,
speaking as someone who has read, for instance, The Cat Who Walked Through Walls, it's really true. I think Heinlein had a touch of wistful longing about women, all women, any woman, any time, any place, three of them. Yeah. He didn't outgrow it. It was one of his later novels, and one of the things that irritated me was the fact that all of the women in the novel would meet the male protagonist, our hero, and immediately you knew what was on her mind. It was like, when you ditch her, you're going to see me later. I mean, it was quite obnoxious. There was no reason for them to be so hot for this guy's body. He was just,
Do you think that took away from some of his writing?
Yeah, it became quite annoying. I am a feminist, true. This is true.
The F word.
But, no.
But do you think it took away from some of the storylines, is what I'm asking? Yes,
it did, because it became so irritating. It wasn't just one woman falling in love with him. It became
a constant distraction.
Constant. It became quite the distraction. Yes, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so fond of his so-called juvenile works. I think they're so much more adult in their attitudes about women. I mean, A Tunnel in the Sky. I mean, the men and women get together and they're on the frontier world, and they're together. I mean,
Rolling Stones also.
Again, yeah.
I keep bringing up Rolling Stones. It's one of my favorites.
Well, it's a good one.
And it had like that wonderful description of how inefficient a car is. You know, in fact, you don't even realize when you're first reading it that he's talking about a car. He's talking about, he's talking about this clunky, inefficient, lousy machine. And it's a very complex, intricate. It's the most intricate description of a car I've ever seen. And then you realize, hey, wait a minute, that's a Ford. You know, what he's talking about here. That was very technical.
Next week when we discussed the role of role-playing games.
The role of role-playing games?
The role of role-playing games.
You didn't write that, did you?
Somebody wrote it.
Oh, all right.
Who gets the writing credits?
You and me and John. It's
you and me and, yeah, okay.
Oh, anyway.
You and me and, I'd love to correct, all right, enough. until we discuss role-playing games, I'd just like to say, what is it? Ton Stoffel.
There ain't no such thing as a free lunch.
Good night.